Happy New Year, everybody. And hopefully 2024 will be even a better angling year for most of you. But I'm going to address a question that was posed to me by one of you about why it's so tough to catch fish during the winter months. It seems to be a challenge for more than just a few. I field this question quite often at trade shows and at seminars. It seems like people just stop fishing once it starts getting cold outside. Well, for me, fishing this time of year can be one of the best opportunities to catch fish on artificials. So, we're going to talk about why you're not catching fish this winter, and then hopefully, I can suggest a few solutions that will put you on the path to catching more fish through January, February, and early March. The next 10, 12 weeks are going to be important. So, let's go inside the studio and talk about this. All right. Well, like I said earlier, Happy New Year. It is a little crispy cold today, so we're coming in here to talk about this a little bit more. And we're really talking about why you're not catching fish this winter. Well, just like yourself, the fish themselves are uncomfortable. They really are. When you get a series of cold fronts that start rolling into your town, and your barometer seems like it's high a good bit of the time. Your water's definitely colder, those colder water temps. You've also got to deal with the water is clearer in many of these areas. Even if you live in a zone where you have tannic water, it's still cleaner and clearer. There's not a lot of algae and particulate in the water unless you've had it roiled up by wind or something like that. And then the water itself is lower. So not only are you uncomfortable, the fish are uncomfortable too. Everyone's not as happy as they are in the spring or what we just had in the fall. So when it gets to be this time of year, you just have to be a little smarter. I know we talk about getting a gentleman's start, starting off at 9:30, 10, 10:30 in the morning before you ever get going, giving that sun time to get up, getting the fish comfortable. But let me tell you something about fish in general. They're cold-blooded, so their metabolism is directly related to the actual water temperature. So that I'm not speaking just to the people that live in my area of Florida, my region. But I'm going to give you kind of a parallel or a correlation. My fish, where I live, they're probably most happy when the water temperature is between 70 degrees and 75 degree water temp. That is when life is good. They are whacking everything you throw at them. And it's wonderful. But when you reach January and February, and even going into March at times when you have a winter that kind of drags on in Florida. I know in a lot of the country, wintertime goes all the way to May. But here in Florida, your winter is maybe just before the holidays, and it's pretty much damn near over by the first week or two of March. By the time you hit spring break, boy, everything's beautiful here. But realistically, if my water temperature is ideal, if you will, between 70 and 75, and I shaved off, let's just say 15 degrees off that, that means, they're going to be a little uncomfortable around 55 to 60. And that's when they are a little more uncomfortable where I live. Even that being said, they still will acclimate to that type of water temperature and begin to feed pretty readily. Now, they're not going to eat as much, but there's ways to change that. There's ways to get them to bite, and you just have to adjust your style of fishing. So I try to time things more toward the slower tides. I'm not so interested in the big extreme tides all the time unless I'm trying to focus on that negative tide a lot. That negative tide sometimes will concentrate fish, which make them easier targets if you know how to catch them. But I'm looking for those windows where the sun, when you're post front, will have an opportunity to warm that water up, because as soon as you go from the trend of water that is going down, which make them much tougher to catch as that water is falling in temperature, and it starts to bottom out and starts to come back up, well, that's when the magic happens. If you can time when that water temp starts to go up a little bit, that day 2 or 3 before the next front gets there and it's warming up a little bit, that is when you can really change your luck and have a good understanding on why the wintertime can be awesome for you. I mean, you can predict when you're going to catch fish. So let's talk about some of those ideas and some of those solutions that will make it so that you can catch more fish. Like this one in particular. Most of the time, we're fishing in the wrong neighborhood. What do I mean by that? Okay, remember I just mentioned a gentleman's start. You're wanting to start later because you assume that the water temperature is going to be warmer and the fish are going to behave, well, a little bit better. But if you're fishing a cloudy day, or you're fishing an incoming tide, and that water's colder on the outside than it is on the inside where it's kind of been protected and warmed up a little bit, well, that's not necessarily true. The water temperature could actually go down by starting later. So here's a rule of thumb that I use a lot. If I'm fishing early, and sometimes I will fish early in the wintertime, I'm not going to be out there in the dark, but I would be out there as the sun's coming up. But many of us just fish the wrong neighborhood. You're fishing the same stuff that you fish in the spring and in the summer and in the early fall. And you fish the same style. You're still fishing those fast-moving paddle tails and those jerk shads. You're thinking, oh, it's early, so I'll throw a top water. You're doing all the things that you do during the other times of the angling year. And those don't necessarily work as well when you get to the colder part of the seasons. So when I head out, and tomorrow morning I have a trip with my friend Rick. Rick's a regular client. We shoot a lot of YouTube with him. We're going to go out and we're going to fish deep first, because what happens is a lot of fish, especially speckled trout and redfish, overnight they will slide off and look for more of an insulating depth. That could be 6 feet, that could be 10 feet, it could be 25 feet if there's a deep enough hole. But the water temp stays much more consistent at depth. Many tropical species, such as snook that we have here in Tarpon, that are residents, those fish may move very far inland and look for freshwater refuges where the water's a few degrees warmer because it's got rotting vegetation on the bottom, or there's a spring, or there's some type of power plant deal, something that keeps the water more of a constant. But most of us are fishing for speckled trout and redfish. So they're going to look for more insulating depth. So in the early light hours up until maybe mid-morning or so, I'm typically fishing much deeper. I'm not pulling a flat looking to throw into potholes. If I found a fish in a pothole early in the morning, he's probably going to be like locked down and not wanting to do anything. And I'm not going to be able to catch him anyway. So many of us just need to change our tactics, change our style, and fish deeper in the wintertime. Focus on the deeper parts of the creek. Focus on the intercoastal. Focus on residential canals. Focus on marina basins and things like that. Don't focus on that flats fishing that we have made so ever popular, even on this channel, as we call it FlatsClass, because it probably on falling water temperature or static cold water is not going to be nearly as good. Now that could change if the water temp was going up. As the day matures, what you'll find is those trout will go from here in 6, 8, 10 feet of water, and they'll move up the lip of whatever they were holding in. It might have been a basin, it might have been a creek or whatever, and they'll slide up into those first series of holes or drains that go up onto a flat, and they'll sit up there and they'll sun, or they'll look for rock, oyster, something like that, and they'll sit up there on the brightest part of the day and start to warm up. As the day gets farther into the day and the light's getting a little bit lower, by then you've got maximum radiation that's happened in the water, and the fish generally start to feed a little bit better. They really do. Now, a way that you can, in my opinion, be more successful once you're able to find fish that are moving around and you've got some stuff going on where you can see redfish starting to tip a little bit, or maybe you see one swimming along and they're not locked down or buried half in the mud, you need to focus your whole attention on fishing this way. Slow. I mean slow. You cannot fish the way you fish the rest of the time throughout the year. So many of you have noticed over, I don't know, almost 2 decades of FlatsClass that a lot of the fishing that I do is bait caster centric. And a lot of that is because I like to have maximum lure control over the speed. So I can move a bait really fast or really slow with a casting reel. It's a lot tougher to be disciplined with a spinning reel and do the same things you can do with a casting reel. This is not a pitch to have you all run out and buy bait casting reels. It's not. I'm just telling you the reason why, because lure control, lure speed is super important when it comes to cold water fishing. The tempo of that bait has to be such that it gets the interest of the game fish and teases them into wanting to get up close to it and eat it. Because if it moves through the zone too fast, it's like, here we go, here we go, here we go. They don't accelerate and chase anything down when you're in January and February. They just don't. It has to be easy. They don't want to expend energy to capture prey if there's going to be something that's half dead laying on the bottom. In fact, a lot of natural bait fishing guides, this is a good time of year when they get those negative times, because they'll fish dead bait or shrimp on the bottom, and they're not plagued with the number of catfish and stingrays that they might catch in the warmer months. They catch a lot of the good fish on those types of baits this time of year. So what I like to do is I like to fish extremely slow. A lot more rod movement, letting the bait fall down, and then just reeling maybe a turn or two, and then do the same thing. So don't be in a hurry to really, you've heard this expression 1,000 times. If you think you're fishing slow, fish slower. Well, it's true. It really is. This time of year, you have to cover the zones much, much slower. It's okay to give the bait some action this way, where it glides and glides back, but it doesn't make a lot of forward progress. It has to stay in that strike zone for a longer period of time. It can't be hopping and bouncing like a jerk shad, a fast-moving paddle tail. Paddle tail doesn't have a whole lot of action if it can't be moved through the water, because it needs the water to run down the body of the bait to move the tail. So oftentimes, unless you're throwing it, letting it get all the way to the bottom and rolling it super slow, and I'm going to be honest with you, you can say what you will about me pitching brands that I'm associated with, because I am a paid professional angler. I'm not just the everyday guy. But unless you're using a thermal, a TPE bait or something like that, like Z-Man's Elastec, if you roll it slow, the tail has no action. It has zero action. You have to have a bait where the tail will barely move. So the Z-Man baits do a good job in that. Doesn't matter if the water's 32 degrees or if it's 102 degrees, it still moves exactly the same way. So you have to just roll it along slow. That's why baits like the Bugs jigs that you can get out there in Texas are so effective this time of year, because you can bounce them along, stop them, and then just the hair on the jig, the rabbit fur breeze. You bounce them along a foot or so, and then it just breathes. That super slow, painful, dragging motion works. If you're going to use plugs, like I like to use in many situations, and you see a lot of videos about hard baits for me this time of year, and the reason is I can thump, thump, just 2 flicks, and I can just let them kind of waffle in the water, or they'll slow glide like the Paul Brown. They'll just kind of slow glide, and then they'll fall. And those are basically the wounded looks that get these fish to react, because it has to stay in their awareness area for a long period of time to get them to move. And many of the finishes, the metallic finishes or the bright finishes that you have on hard baits this time of year, even if I'm looking off in the distance because I've got cleaner water and I'm a predator fish, and I see that glint and it just kind of hangs there, and then I see it glint again a second or 2 later and it's not moving fast, you might kind of swim over just to check it out. And eventually, the way I fish this time of year is I make a presentation and I work it through. I don't throw it 15 or 20 degrees over here on the next cast. I just move it like maybe 10 degrees and then I throw another one. Because I may have got one to move on the last cast, but he didn't commit. And the next cast in that same zone, I could get him. So you gotta be more surgical, you gotta be more methodical, and you've got to move the lures with a slower tempo. That's the real secret. Now here's a few other tricks that I know will help you. So here's a few things I have found that works well for me. Many times I'll make line choices based off conditions. So if I'm throwing a bait casting setup with a plug on it, and the front's arriving and we got rolling clouds and it's blowing and there's a little roil on the surface, and I know I'm going to be faced with casting into the wind at times, I'm not going to be using 20-pound braid on my bait caster. I might be using 30. And sometimes maybe even 40, but 30 is a good choice because I'm not gonna get as many backlashes. Yes, I do get backlashes. I'm not gonna have to pick them out. It's gonna be easier to pick them out if it's heavier braid to start with. So 30 and 40, I'll just lengthen my leader length. But let's just say you're fishing one of those high barometer days. It tightens fish up. You're going to have to make a longer cast. And maybe you're going to have to make that cast with a spinning rod because you're not going to be able to cast far enough, a smaller offering to these fish that are visible if it's the brighter part of the day. Then of course, you're going to be dropping down to 8 and 10-pound braid. And it's not only for the casting distance to get there, but it's also for the signature that it leaves on the surface. Now, braid floats. Everyone knows braid floats. And if you have a thicker braid on the top of the surface and the water's crystal clear, it's easier for fish to see it, especially if it's green or if it's a darker blue. It's going to leave something that's pretty visible to them in 1.5 feet, 2 feet of water if they're sunning up on some rock or something like that. So in those cases, you're going to want to use a white braid or a gray braid, or maybe a washed out light blue braid, something that blends in to the sky so it's not as visible. It's thinner diameter. I like to use a lot of 10-pound braid this time of year, or even 8. And that way they don't feel it or see it as easily. Now, naturally, you're gonna still tie on a long leader. I never really tie leaders that are any longer than 6 feet long. I do tie some 6-foot leaders this time of year. It happens, especially on spinning gear. Now I'm going to tell you something that I've been doing for the last couple of seasons, and that's either if I'm fishing a little deeper, I'll throw fluorocarbon on my bait casters. If I'm fishing shallow and I'm sight fishing, I'll have one reel spooled up with maybe mono. Yes, mono. This is a copolymer low stretch mono that's made by Diamond Fishing Products, but I'll even use mono because when I first got started fishing, that's what we used all the time. And mono is slicker, like fluorocarbon, and it doesn't have a sonic sound that moves through the water. Now, this time of year, we're moving the bait slower anyway. But you're probably saying, so what pound mono? This is 12. It's easy for me to cast on the bait caster a long way. Don't get as many backlashes with mono or fluorocarbon. It's just smoother. It's not as limp. And then when I'm moving or flicking a bait, it doesn't have that sonic sound in the water. Plus, it dampens the action of the lure, if you will. Imagine, no stretch and braid, that lure can move a little quicker than you want to. But if you're using fluorocarbon or if you're using a low stretch mono like this Diamond Illusion, it slows it down. It's an advantage. And what does it hurt to have one reel in the boat loaded up with that so that you can do it? Again, I'm going to tell you, you're going to want to fish deep early and shallower later if it's sunny enough. You might be fishing deep all day. When I'm fishing early in the morning and I know the fish are a little deeper and they're staying tighter at the bottom, many times I use just smaller lures. I know that they're cold and they're not probably that aggressive unless you're timing it on a salooner. So I will use things like bugs, jigs. I'll even take a spoon sometimes, swing it down a residential canal, let it go all the way to the bottom. It'll flutter all the way to the bottom, let it settle on the bottom, and then hop it a little bit so it'll come up off the bottom like a jigging spoon and kind of flutter back down. You can do the same thing with sinking plugs. Take an 18 MR, perfect. 18 MR is the heavier version or the heavy Dean to the 17 MR. Do the same thing. Count it down, it'll fall pretty quick. Get down to the bottom, falls like a foot per second. So if you're fishing a canal that's 6 or 10 feet deep, just go 1, 2, 3, down till you know it's down there right next to the bottom. And then kind of just lift it. It'll just come up off the bottom, maybe 18, 20 inches, and then just let it rock back down. You'd be surprised. And the bite's gonna be real subtle because it's gonna go down. You may not even feel it if you're not looking at the line on the water, which is the nice thing about the white braid this time of year, is you can see if the line jumps because it's visible looking this way. It's not as visible looking that way. And then as soon as you get that jump, you can come tight and you are hooked up. Lots of times when you go to flick it again, the weight's just there. They're just on. So that's important to me. Now, when the fish move shallower later in the day, if it's bright and you've got the right tide and everything like that, I'll still use typically smaller baits. I'll use the MR19 or I'll use the Mirrolure, slow sinking baits. The MR22 is one of my favorites. I don't use a lot of top water this time of year unless we have successive days and the water goes from, wow, it was just 59 4 days ago and now all of a sudden it's 68 or 69 or 70 in the afternoon. Well, then all of a sudden top water might be a play, but you still got to walk it really slow, just like that. Never be in a hurry this time of year. So here's some other baits that will up your chances. You know, I've been talking mostly about falling water temps and steady cold water temps, but you are going to have those days where the fronts get a day or two further apart than they normally do, and you get that 2 or 3 day window where that water temp might have been, like I said, 58 or 59, and now all of a sudden, you know, in the morning it's 64. It's 5 degrees warmer. Woo, wow, this afternoon it'll probably be in the shallows, it'll probably be 68 or 69. And that's what happens when you get that trending water temperature that's going up before the next front. The fish do stay deep overnight, and in the morning they don't ever really wander far from that deep water. They really don't. Maybe a couple of 100 yards max, that's it. then they'll slide up as that sun gets high, they'll slide up that edge, get up on that flat, and start wandering around. And you'll notice that mullets seem more active, and there's a lot of things becoming a little bit more active than what you've seen over the past few days. Well, then you can, with a longer leader system, you can start using baits. And I like it when that water temperature gets in those mid 60s. Then baits like the 27 MR, and you've seen some of my videos where we lighten up the factory hooks and we actually put on here those BKK hooks. We'll put those on so that this becomes almost like a floater diver, like the old 7M or the Double D that the Texas guys love. Or you'll see us pick up some of our Paul Brown baits and start throwing these. These things are fantastic, especially if you like catching speckled trout, because I don't think anything can catch a speckled trout as good as a Paul Brown lure. It really is just an amazing, amazing lure. But the leader system that I like to use when it starts getting cold, if I'm using braid on a spinning rod, or if I'm using a casting reel on those darker days or those windier days where I have to have that heavier braid, now all of a sudden I really do need 6 feet a leader. But I can't use 6 feet of 20 or 30 pound leader, because if I do, it's going to affect the way I fish that lure too much. So something that I like to do is I'll tie on, let's just say I want the maximum amount of invisibility. I'll take 4.5 to 5 feet of 12 to 15 pound fluorocarbon. Typically it's 15 pound fluorocarbon. I'll join it with a small modified Albright. You can tie an FG knot. If you're gonna tie an FG knot, this is the time of year to tie it. The rest of the year, it doesn't matter nearly as much as this because you've got a long leader. Tie one of those 2 knots. It's such a small knot. It goes to the guides very easy. I never let it go into that very first guide, that stripper guide that comes, the first guide that comes off the reel. I make it so that that knot sits outside of that. But I can cast that, and then my little bit of bite tippet that I need is usually about 12, maybe 15 inches long. I'll put 20 or 25, sometimes 30 if I think there's the possibility of catching a snook in my zone. But generally it's 20 or 20, and you're like, wow, that's not a big step up from 15 to 20 or 25. Well, if I know I'm only going to have 20 pound, I might use 12 pound fluorocarbon to start it off as the butt section. But I put those 2 lines together, the 12 and the 20 together, with a blood knot or a no-name knot. It works perfectly. It's small, you can cut it really tight, so it's not going to matter. It's not going in and out of your guides, and the fish aren't going to pick up on it if it's fluorocarbon. If I'm going to use 25, I might use 15 pound for the butt section. But that's how I put together those longer leaders, so I don't have a giant knot with straight 20 or straight 25, just because I'm too lazy to tie 2 knots instead of 1. You get it? I mean, that works. Those step down leaders, and we've done videos on that before, they work well. Here's the other benefit to it. Not only does it move through that guide train on that rod better, but it also allows for better action on the plug with less movement. Your bait doesn't have to be moved harder to get it to have that look. You know, just a little flick, and it, because that butt section's so supple, it works really good. And the fish, well, I feel they definitely do not see your line as easily as they would if you tied a shorter section on. Now, a lot of guys, they're going to do what they're going to do, and they're going to, oh, I never tie more than 2 feet on or 3 feet on, and that's fine. This time of year, this whole conversation got started with, why am I not catching enough fish in the wintertime? Now let's talk about a couple of lures that I feel are the best lures for this time of year. One would be the smaller plugs, and that's everything from a Mirrodine MR17 to the MR19, which would be the Miro Minnow, the 9MR, which would be the Miro Glass, the 22. All those are going to be fantastic this time of year. The Bugs Jig, going to be an excellent bait this time. Any of the Ned style Z-Man baits, they all work good, whether you use the Finesse TRD, the Ticklers, the new Ned salty shrimps, even the TRD craws, any of those baits that fit underneath that 3-inch number, the Slim Swims, all of those. We just talked about some of that stuff in a video I did called Ultra Finesse. So check that video out. We'll put the link in below. All those are going to work great. And then when you get some warm-up days, again, it's going to be 27s that might be modified from Mirrolure, which are the XLs, the Paul Brown system, whether you're using Fat Boys, the original, which we call the OGs, some of the baits that are custom out in Texas, the Corkies, or those type of baits are going to work this time of year. They're just going to work. I like to use the Z-Man Trout Trick, which is just a soft plastic stick bait that's about 5 inches long. I put it on the lightest jig head that I can find, and I like to dip that one around. Sometimes I'll rig it on a Texas hook, but all of those work fantastic this time of year. All right, well, I hope I answered the question why you're not catching fish this winter in a sense, and got your wheels turning in your head how you're going to be a little bit more dangerous this January and February. And if you like what we're teaching here, what you're learning here, we try to give you the benefit of my experience over the last 35, 40 years of fishing, and give you that knowledge that will put you, even if you're not doing exactly what I'm doing for your body of water, I'm sure you can take little bits and parts of this and make it work for you to catch more fish. If it's doing that for you, give us that thumbs up, and also share and comment down below. Let your friends know about this channel. I want to get our subscribers up to 50K, because as soon as I get to 50K, Lateral Media is going to give me a full-time videographer, and we're going to take you guys on the road. We're going to go places other than right here in West Central Florida. We're going to be down in the Keys. We're going to go to Jacksonville, Florida. We're going to go up to the Carolinas. We're going to run over to Louisiana. We're going to go a lot more places, cool places, and teach more of you how to catch inshore fish. All right, that's all I got for you today. Happy New Year once again. I'm going to go back out in the shop and start organizing gear, because that's what I was doing before I made this video. And I promised my wife I'd get stuff off the shop floor. That should be a video coming up.